Welcome. Good morning, everyone. I'm Lisa Grennan. I'm the Family Program Manager for MWR for Family Programs, and welcome to Post-Traumatic Stress and Moral Injury, Coping and Communications. And I am so excited to introduce to you our speakers for today. And we have Kevin and Tina Thompson, and Tina works for Michigan State University as an instructor and coordinator for the Combat Veterans Certificate Program. And Kevin is a OIF veteran in the Marine Corps and also works at the Ann Arbor VA. And they're here today to talk about moral injury and how they can co-occur with PTS, but how they're uniquely different. And then effective communication and how they have learned through a process of how to communicate better together as a couple and communication with someone with post-traumatic stress and moral injury. So welcome, and you guys can take it away.
Thanks, Lisa. Before we get started, there is a reaction feature in Zoom. So I'm curious if folks are willing to raise your hand if you are a service member or a veteran. If you can also raise your hand if you are a loved one, a family member or a friend of someone who has served.
It's jumping up now.
All right. Thank you for sharing. It helps us understand a bit more of the audience that we have with us today in terms of understanding folks that we have tuning in and the connection that you might have to the topics that we'll be discussing. It looks like I'm staring at the corner of my screen. That's where your videos are showing up. So I like to see your faces as I talk. Kevin, do you want to go ahead and give the disclaimer?
Yes. So again, I have two computers side by side since I lost the power cord to do dual monitor. So I'm looking off screen as well as I talk to you from the other computer. But, we want to start by a warning of sorts that since we may have service members or veterans in the audience, the topics of moral injury can be deeply triggering. And for most veterans we have spoken with in the past in our work and just in our relationships, they've never heard of moral injury before. And learning about moral injury and how it is different from post-traumatic stress has allowed many of these veterans to finally give a name to the deep moral pain that they have struggled with, sometimes for decades. There is a reason that medications and evidence-based treatments haven't helped alleviate their feelings of guilt, shame, grief, thoughts of suicide. Their moral injury hasn't been healed. I believe I can make these statements as I was one of these veterans. I'm a Marine Corps veteran, and I've served 8 years. Having been exposed to several world tours and one combat tour, I found myself struggling with many things, as I just mentioned above, with the shame, guilt, and remorse. But over the next hour, we hope to shed some light and share some information that may interest you to continue your learning on this topic, to care for yourself, your loved ones, or even your friends and clients that you may work with. So we'll be sharing these resources at the end of our time together. We hope to have a few minutes open for discussion or any questions you may have through the whole process of this lecture. Next slide, please.
All right, so by way of background, before I hit the next slide, Kevin and I have been together since summer of 2005. That's when we met. It was also right before he was deployed to Iraq. So we have been together from his combat deployment ever since. At the time, I was a student in the MSW program at MSU, and I had a BSW degree. At that point, I had 5 years of social work education under my belt. And when he returned from Iraq in March of 2006, I had absolutely no exposure to the world that he had lived in for so long and the trauma that he had just experienced being in combat. So our work through MSU, while Kevin does work at the VA, he's also a key component of the Combat Veteran Certificate Program. He's the motivation behind it, in that our certificate program is our answer to that gap in training that I received, that we hope to better prepare not just social work students, but mental health professionals across different disciplines, as well as we've had many veterans take our classes, as well as loved ones of veterans. So the certificate is a response to our experience and our struggles over the last now almost 17 years.
Now I feel old, yeah.
Right, we've been together a long time. Right, so this next video we're going to share you is going to talk a little bit about our journey and what the certificate is about. This image here carries a lot of emotional significance for both of us. This is a day that I didn't learn about until many, many years later. Would have been the day that Kevin took his life. He was in a deep, dark place, and I had absolutely no idea. Our kids are now almost 7 and 9, so this photo's from quite a few years ago. But the certificate program was already up and running. We were already teaching this content, and I still had no idea the pain that Kevin was in. And we did the revolving door of trying to get help, Kevin getting medication, trying evidence-based treatments, nothing working, nothing working, nothing working. And it took us stepping out of that revolving door to get the healing that he desperately needed, which he'll talk about during the second half of our time together. So we'll go on to this video.
You know, I didn't want to tell my wife, smile pictures when you're with your family, because that's the thing to do. And in that picture, put a fake smile on just to show everything's okay, everything's fine, and deep down, struggling. You know, I didn't want to tell my wife that I was suicidal. I didn't want anybody to know that.
Kevin and I met summer of 2005, right before he was deployed to Iraq. When we first started dating, it was kind of fun and games, and they would joke about it and make light of it. But it became more and more clear to me the trauma that he had endured when he was in Iraq. So I was really struggling with understanding what he had experienced, what to expect.
My time, I had a few experiences in combat that were rather challenging, and even to this day I still deal with it, because I'm on my third spine surgery trying to fix what happened in my incident. I suffered emotional and physical trauma in Iraq. Painful as the physical trauma can be, usually the emotional trauma is more damaging. Ashamed, I feel guilty, I feel bad about the things that I did, or the things that had happened to me. Trauma like this is a generational thing. It's inherited. My father's one of those guys who never got help. He passed away at 45 years old. He was a Army veteran from Desert Storm, and I figured the best way for him was to drink his pain away.
The coursework is immersive, experiential, intense in that what they learn about and the content that we use, we don't pull back any punches. We want our students to leave the certificate program having heard the real stories of veterans who have been in war.
I'm a readjustment counselor. Long title short, I'm just a therapist. I work strictly with combat veterans. Why I'm so successful, I think, at the work I do, because I don't make them come to me. I meet them where they're at. Not just physically in location, but spiritually and in their heart as well. I hope to teach others the way my kids and other people's kids don't have to deal with the same things we did.
So what we have found through this important work, and just to stress that we are the only certificate program in the entire country that focuses on the unique experiences of veterans who've experienced combat. So we are meeting an important need that is not being fulfilled anywhere else. But what we found through this important work is that the mechanisms behind veteran suicide are incredibly complex. Combat exposure is just one layer of the complex trauma many veterans have experienced. Many veterans have also experienced adverse childhood experiences, and their ACE scores are quite high, meaning that they've experienced significant trauma before they even join the military, which plays a role in enlistment, in that enlistment gives them an opportunity to leave a traumatic family of origin. It also impacts post-deployment adjustment, in that veterans who have significant childhood trauma have higher rates of depression and post-traumatic stress, as well as higher rates of suicidal thoughts and attempts. While combat exposure in and of itself does not lead to suicide, combat exposure does increase risk for post-traumatic stress, depression, and substance abuse, as well as moral injury, all of which also increase the risk for suicide. A meta-analysis conducted in 2015 found that exposure to killing and other war atrocities corresponded to a 43% increased risk for suicidal behavior, which included ideation, attempts, and death. Combat trauma can result in multiple types of injuries, such as traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress, and moral injury. Each of these injuries impact the brain in uniquely different ways, but they are often overlapping, and they require different therapeutic approaches. While the factors contributing to veteran suicide are complex, and not all veterans who die by suicide have experienced combat, we spend a great deal of time in the Combat Veteran Certificate exploring combat trauma, as the experience of combat is far removed from what most civilians know and understand.
All right, so let's start with the definition of moral injury. Tom Voss is an Army OIF veteran, he's an OIF veteran, author of Where War Ends, and featured in the film Almost Sunrise. According to Tom Voss, moral injury is a wound to the soul. It happens when you participate in or witness things that transgress your deepest beliefs about what is right and wrong. That manifests as grief, sorrow, shame, and guilt. It shows up as negative thoughts, self-hatred, hatred of others, feelings of regret, obsessive behaviors, destructive tendencies, suicidal ideations, and all-consuming isolation. So the next video features Kenny Toon. He's a USMC OIF veteran who's featured in the documentary, Thank You for Your Service.
After 2003, I was going insane inside of my own head. The turbulence I had with my morals being violated the way they were. I couldn't make sense that I wasn't a murderer. It would actually make me upset when people would come up to me and say, "Oh, thank you for your service, welcome home." I would get angry, and I'd be like, "What do you know? What do you know about being home and coming back from a war and living with these memories? Don't thank me." It's interesting just looking back now, going to combat and not being prepared whatsoever.
When you are in combat, you actually leave your ordinary world behind. You actually enter into a different space. I call it a sacred space because what you're dealing with is death. Your own death, or you're taking the lives of others. That's the act of a God. Then you come back. How does the human psyche handle trying to come to terms with what have I done?
I needed to reevaluate who I am. What have I become? And I saw that I wasn't that same person that I was before. It bothered me at night. It bothered me when I looked at myself in the mirror. It wasn't just trauma. There was something more going on here.
We have a label for it today, moral injury. That type of a wound, it's devastating. But as a mental health provider in the military, I've never even heard of moral injury. How do you help people come to your office when they've killed?
We don't have shells. We're not turtles. We take the hit. So you're going to come to terms with it someday. But it'll sit there in your psyche until you deal with it.
Just checking the chat before I move on, make sure there's no questions so far. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the ways that post-traumatic stress and moral injury overlap, but also how they're uniquely different, because oftentimes moral injury is lumped under post-traumatic stress, and that can do a lot of harm for veterans who are seeking help. According to David Wood, who contributed this Venn diagram, he's a veteran war reporter as well as a Pulitzer Prize winner. Moral injury is the signature wound of post 9/11 veterans and is uniquely different than post-traumatic stress. Post-traumatic stress is a physical stress reaction. Many of the hallmarks of post-traumatic stress, such as hypervigilance and emotional numbness, that startle reflex, they actually serve a purpose while in combat. They allow our service members to survive. Treatment such as cognitive processing therapy and prolonged exposure can help reduce post-traumatic stress symptom severity, especially if moral injury is not co-occurring. If it's strictly post-traumatic stress with no moral injury, those evidence-based treatments can do a lot of good in reducing these symptoms. Moral injury, on the other hand, is an emotional or spiritual reaction to trauma, often experienced through feelings of guilt, shame, grief, betrayal. It's a service member or veteran asking, am I still a good person because of what I did, saw, or failed to do? Moral injury is not necessarily of a religious nature. So referring veterans to chaplains isn't a solution for many veterans. And this may actually make things worse if the veteran is not religious. Post-traumatic stress and moral injury are often lumped together because there is so much overlap in the ways in which they manifest, which is the center section of the diagram, such as anger, depression, anxiety, insomnia, nightmares, and substance abuse to help self-medicate and numb those feelings. But what leads to these manifestations is very different, and moral injury can take months, if not years, to show up. One example we have heard quite often is the experience of having children, and that veterans with moral injury may be triggered by their own children if they feel they are responsible for the death of children while in combat, or that they aren't worthy of bringing life into this world due to the lives they took or failed to save, some going to the extreme length of having a vasectomy so that they don't bring life into this world. A couple other examples. One of our dear friends who shared his story for the Combat Veteran Certificate shares about him being on a mission in Iraq, and his dear friend that he went through basic training with was with him on this deployment. And his friend teased him that he wasn't good enough to be first in line and made our friend change positions. Within seconds, he was shot and killed by a sniper. Did it result in post-traumatic stress? Absolutely. But it also resulted in post-traumatic stress. That decision to change positions resulted in incredible survivor's guilt, incredible crushing grief over the loss of his dear friend. That's different than post-traumatic stress and requires a different approach. It requires healing. It requires forgiveness of oneself. Another example pertaining to children, another veteran who was a former student of mine who went on to share his story for their certificate program, talked about when he was in Iraq and on convoys, many of the Iraqi children would swarm around the tanks begging for candy and for water. And at the beginning of the deployment, many of them played along, and they would give candy and they would give water, and they would talk with the children. But as time went on and morale was taking a hit, their patience with children, I'm trying to think of the right words, their patience with children also diminished. And he shared that they started to throw water bottles at the children, intending to hit them so that they'll move away, rather than giving them the water bottles in a gentle way like they used to. So for him, that experience didn't affect him. He didn't reflect on that experience until many years later when he had children of his own. And he understood that these children were living in an impossible environment. So for him, it was that shame, it was that guilt of how he had treated these children in Iraq. He didn't think about until he had his own kids. But because the causes behind these different types of injuries are different, they must be approached differently as well. It's not enough to simply treat the manifestations or the symptoms, the things that we see here in the middle. For veterans who have moral injury, healing is needed, not treatment. In fact, some evidence-based treatments that help with post-traumatic stress, such as prolonged exposure, can actually make moral injury worse. For both post-traumatic stress and moral injury, we also see an increased risk for suicide. So this is according to Mindy Keenan. We have her book as one of our recommendations towards the end of our time this morning. According to Mindy Keenan, she's the founder for the Center of Post-Traumatic Growth in California. The current evidence-based treatments have been developed to address the symptoms associated with post-traumatic stress, but they fall short when addressing the core issues of moral injury, including unresolved loss, guilt, and shame. Moral injury often co-occurs with post-traumatic stress, but one condition may exist without the other. For us to assist those with moral injury to heal, we must know what we are treating and use the appropriate interventions, or we risk making moral injury worse. And on the reference slide, we give a link to a white paper that this quote was taken from. And she ends this white paper by stating, "We must start treating moral injury if the suicides are to stop." Point blank. According to Dr. William Nash, a VA psychiatrist and expert on moral injury who worked with service members and veterans for decades, some PTSD treatment protocols can aggravate moral injury. Nash points out that reliving a traumatic incident many times in a safe environment to diffuse the fear through prolonged exposure can sometimes bring moral injury to emotional immediacy and make it harder to address. So again, mental health professionals needing to be able to tease apart what is post-traumatic stress, what is moral injury, and if they are co-occurring, understanding that treatments for post-traumatic stress can make moral injury worse. And this is something that Kevin and I have both seen time and time and time again, of veterans who receive these evidence-based treatments and are still in so much emotional and spiritual pain, are still suicidal, even though they successfully completed the treatment. Kevin, back to you.
So my time as a vet center therapist, I will get a number of veterans who come in from the VA, say they've done this treatment, that treatment, and they're just frustrated themselves. They can't figure out why they're not getting better and such in the clinician's eyes and in their eyes and such. And, you know, moral injury can be felt for decades if not addressed and healed, which is powerfully captured in the video with this guy you see here named Lonnie, who served in Vietnam 50 years ago. As you listen to his story, pay attention to the pain he experiences for the decades later. Watch his eyes, listen to his tone of his voice. You know, 50 years later, you think that he'd be fine, no issues. But watch how you see moral injury come out as he talks. Please play.
At the beginning of the video, there's some things that are beeped out. Try to look past that. They're beeping out the names of those he served with to protect their identity.
Do you remember the first time you killed someone?
Yeah. That night, I'd shot all my ammo, most of it, and I was working on when were over here, they were dead. Was with him. We had to have him hold his intestines in when we got him to the chopper. I was the only one up there that wasn't hurt, and scared to death, really, 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 really scared. So I started asking, screaming for help. Somebody get up here and help me. I'm alone. And then two little heads. I was down, and all I could see was his head and shoulder. He had a hard hat on. And then I saw the red emblem. It was. And then when I could see a silhouette, I blasted them. Silhouettes. They're not real people, they're just targets.
Is that how you kind of saw it? When you try to disconnect them as people?
That was what we were taught to do. I just thought, that just came out. That was what we were set. You know, those aren't people, those are silhouettes.
Was there ever another time that was memorable? And you said it was about a year later.
The kills aren't, no, it's just that later, after you get home, he was a young man just like I was, only he was in his country, trying to keep me, the son of a bitch that's trying to take his country, from taking his country. I didn't try to make it wrong, it just was wrong.
Did you feel it was wrong at the moment?
No, I was trying to, I didn't give a fuck who he was. I was trying to keep me alive. It wasn't me and a Vietnamese, it was me and anybody that's got oh man, this is hard. Once you realize they're gone, they're dead, then what death looks like is nothing. There's nothing there. There's a body there, but there's nothing at all there. It goes from something, a big something, to the smallest nothing that there can be. It goes from dreams and aspirations to nothing. You know, you can kick it, you can hit it with a stick, you can throw rocks on it, you can do anything, and it won't bother it because it's dead.
What were you personally fighting for?
I wasn't fighting for God, country, anything. All that stuff went to the wayside as soon as you kill your first person. It's no longer, everything becomes a fraud. You know, they lied to you. The people that have all the money will never have to fight for their freedom. They got us to do that. They got the poor people to do that. They got the stupid idiots to do that.
What are your beliefs on killing? Do you ever think it's just?
I do want to say really quick, the moral injury can happen through incidences beyond combat as well. So we've also heard many stories of moral injury, the sense of betrayal happening as a result of military sexual trauma. Many Vietnam veterans also talk about feeling betrayed by their country when they returned home from Iraq. That's also a moral injury from Vietnam, I'm sorry. So moral injury is acts that happen in war. The sense of having to play God and decide who lives and who dies. That's the thing that many people think of when it comes to moral injury, but it can also be much more nuanced. It can be witnessing loss of life, feeling like you didn't do enough to save innocent lives, civilian lives. It can be betrayal by those in leadership, by those in command. It can be betrayal by those right alongside you, who breached that sacred trust by assaulting you. So moral injury within our context focuses a lot on those decisions made in combat, but I do want to acknowledge that moral injury can be caused by a lot of other types of incidences that can lead to feelings of guilt, shame, grief, betrayal. Kevin, did you have anything else you wanted to share about the Vietnam vets you worked with?
Yeah, it's when you're present with somebody, it's always hard to try and figure out your go-to diagnosis. They almost anybody can display the diagnosis of this direction or that direction. It's not really until you hear it in their voice or you look in their eyes and you can see, like use Lonnie, for instance, you saw how his stare was blank. You saw in his tone of his voice how it was difficult, the things he was saying. Moral injury is almost always there in any person who struggles with the notion of right and wrong. And a lot of the Vietnam veterans I worked with, I have one in particular that I still remember that once brought in a handful of pictures, and his pictures weren't from actual combat stuff that he was experienced to. It was the aftermath where he was required to pick up and move all these different Vietnamese soldiers who had been killed the night prior, and how they were just dumping them in a giant pile, almost like they were rag dolls or pieces of garbage the way it looked. It was just a big pile of a mess. And he wasn't involved in the firefight, but he was ordered to clean the mess up. And his personal spiritual beliefs on what to do with the body after it was passed on was violated. He was told to just throw him in a pile, just get rid of him. And he saved the pictures all those years and brought him to our session one time. And at that moment, I was like, oh, a light just went off my head. Now I know why you're so angry and why you're such a jerk in our sessions, in a sense. You're always challenging and so forth, is because you're struggling with this and you don't know how to understand your feelings about the matter. And a few weeks later, it dawned on him. It made sense in his own mind, in his own heart. So moral injury is a very tough thing to deal with. You never want to look at that first.
Thank you. Moral injury has always existed. If you read some of the Greek mythology, there's notions, there's incidences of moral injury all throughout Greek mythology. I'm even thinking about Odysseus and the many years he was at sea because he wasn't ready to return home, in terms of dealing with the combat trauma that he had experienced and the wounds to his soul. So moral injury has always existed as long as there's been war. But the spiritual pain associated with moral injury has been stripped away from the ways combat trauma has been described over the centuries, all the way up to the most current diagnosis that captures the effects of combat trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder. And I'm sure many people here are aware that post-traumatic stress disorder was actually added to the DSM as a way to capture the symptoms that many Vietnam veterans were exhibiting when they returned home from Vietnam. And as we know, it now is used for survivors of all different types of trauma. I did have a slide that I removed because I thought it might have gotten too far into the weeds, but I do want to highlight that the evidence-based treatments that we know can help reduce symptomology of post-traumatic stress. And this is all out in the public when you're on some of these government websites, that these gold standard treatments, the evidence they're based on is largely civilians who have been sexually assaulted. Of the 28 studies documented on the VA website, only 7 have to do with veterans and exposure to combat. So we're taking a different population with a different type of trauma and trying to put them into these same types of treatments. And we're wondering why is the suicide number staying the same? Something isn't working. And in our work with the Combat Veteran Certificate, we are very, very firm in our belief that 2 things are being missed: moral injury, obviously, as well as pre-military trauma. What happens before these men and women even join the military, that these things are not addressed in any real specific way, or they're lumped in under other things, and then additional harm is done. So the phrase moral injury was coined in 1994 by Dr. Jonathan Shea. 2 books that we would highly recommend is Achilles in Vietnam and Odysseus in America. And then he talks about some of this history of moral injury and how it has always been something that those who've experienced war have struggled with. A quote from Achilles in Vietnam: "I've come to strongly believe through my work with Vietnam veterans that moral injury is an essential part of any combat trauma that leads to lifelong psychological injury. Veterans can usually recover from horror, fear, and grief once they return to civilian life, so as long as what's right has not also been violated." So in thinking about Lonnie, how might his experiences in Vietnam have caused moral injury? In what ways did you see, hear, or feel this in his story? Just a couple things to think about, because we have to keep moving along. But it's very clear in the pain that is conveyed in his story that there's a lot of moral injury that remains unhealed.
Having a technical difficulty, Tina.
All right, I'll do it. So this is another veteran who served in the first Gulf War in the Marine Corps, Leonard Shelton. But we want to show this video because many veterans, like the example that I shared earlier of our friend who changed positions and his friend was shot and killed by a sniper. Many veterans are able to recall the exact moment their soul was injured or lost. There's a fracturing of a person's soul from their body, a split moment, and they are no longer the same person. In some of these instances, like in the story of Leonard Shelton, they can feel their soul leave their body.
Combat, what I lost. On the 29th of January, 1991, on that day, I lost what is called a soul by some. During heavy combat, I was sent to assist the company gunny there, and on the site were the remains of 7 dead, unrecognizable Marines. At that moment, in a split second, something left my body, and I could not speak, I could not talk, I could not say anything. Something left my body, and I didn't know what to do about it. But the fighting continued. I then became a part of war. That is when I became a part of it. What I lost on that day, I will never get it back. I'm like an empty shell that you see every day.
So this goes back to the work of Dr. Nash. For folks who want to learn more about moral injury, I encourage you to read his work. These are the facets of moral injury and the many areas of a person's life that are impacted when they experience moral injury. So we talked a bit about the emotional symptomology in terms of feeling shame, guilt, anger, contempt, loss of honor, as well as loss of joy. There's also relationship implications in terms of veterans who've experienced moral injury, feeling a loss of ability to trust others, of severing ties with people that they were once close to, feeling disconnected, even from their closest loved ones, feeling contaminated, no longer worthy of love, as well as not feeling worthy of forgiveness. Their self-concept is also impacted in terms of feeling things like no longer being good, can't be trusted, being a failure, feeling hopeless. There's also changes in their view of the world in terms of feeling there is no God, there is no goodness, there is no meaning, life has no purpose. feel they've lost authority over their own body, over their own being, in terms of having an inability to calm themselves down. They feel like they've lost the ability to control themselves, feeling impulsive, having outbursts, or being unresponsive. And these things are continuous over time. As we mentioned, that without healing, without these strategies that we'll discuss here in the next few slides, this can continue for a very long time. Lisa and I were talking before the session started about some of the students we have in the Combat Veteran Certificate, and that many of them also complete a field placement and internship where they're working with service members or veterans. And one of our students, she's actually the social work director now at a hospice in the UP. And a lot of her work is sitting bedside of veterans in their final moments. And the stories that she has shared, she's come back to talk to our current students in the certificate of the moral injury that they have held on until their final moments of life. That in those final moments, they're finally sharing these moral injuries that they have held on to for so long. And as many of us know, veterans, and I experienced this with Kevin, the stoicism, the not showing signs of weakness, having to be strong, having to have your crap together, so to speak, it runs strong. It's indoctrinated, for lack of a better word, when many of these men and women are 18, 19, 20 years old. It doesn't leave just because they're no longer in the service. So this was happening in my own home and I had no idea, right? So for many veterans, these things are never spoken out loud, especially when those in positions to help don't understand what might really be happening. So it's important to understand the nature of moral injury so that it can be recognized, but also how it can overlap with symptoms of post-traumatic stress, as some of these words we also can associate with post-traumatic stress. But again, they are uniquely different in terms of how they need to be approached. Kevin.
So as you see, the sign says, treatment is not the same as healing. Many can believe that you can treat the symptoms of PTSD. You cannot treat moral injury. The next few slides will give some effective healing, effective ways to help veterans healing and cope from the issues of moral injury. If you go to the next slide, Tina. So I took many approaches to treatment many years ago. As any veteran, I started my local CBOC, started that whole process, got on medications, went to many different therapists, many highly educated, smart women, smart men, all around good people. I self-medicated and even participated in some risky extreme activities. To many, including the VA, there wasn't anything wrong with me. I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress, stopped drinking so much Mountain Dew and see a therapist, everything will be fine. But then one day, Tina had seen a movie with her colleague, and when she came home that night, she gave me an application to fill out for this 5-day war detox. And after many years of failed attempts at evidence-based practices, meds, so that, fine. What do I got to lose, So I filled the thing out, and to me, what seemed maybe a year later, I get a strange phone call, some number out in California. I'm like, oh, this is probably somebody wanting to talk to me about my vehicle's extended warranty or some crap. Answer it. It was the war detox program. It turned out I had met their qualifications and was invited to come and learn how to help myself heal. This program, I learned I wasn't alone and I wasn't different. I'm not some unique individual I'm the only one ever or will be ever struggling with these issues. This is more common than we know. Men and women, people like me, don't talk about these things. And when I got to this place, it was quite interesting because I wasn't alone. A handful of things we did in this place. When I say this place, it wasn't like a lockdown facility or a hospital or anything like that. I was in the middle of Malibu, California. I got to sit on the beach all day. I got to go in the desert and work with these other veterans. We did things such as like memory processing, where we drew mandalas. And come to find, I'd not experienced mandalas, but what I can recall that I would draw a picture and somehow relate it to a memory. And this would allow me to process those memories. We would work on holistic health, meditation. We would do labyrinth walking, allow me to focus on myself, inside myself, allow me to be able to be present in myself, to focus on my breathing, to allow me to be present in myself. Because a lot of times I would feel like a duck on water and I wouldn't be able to calm myself down. So having this type of meditation that they taught, walking through a labyrinth at my pace, allowed me to be present with myself finally. We looked at things like restoration of empathy and acceptance. Everybody has a different story, a different experience. Some are worse than others, and others will say, oh, mine wasn't so bad. Why am I struggling as much? And being immersed with these guys and well, my group was only guys, unfortunately, but it allows us to share stories and see the connections that we have with each other and how together we really were in the whole process. We had able to do grief processing, where we would write a letter to a person in time, to an event in time that we really struggle with. Something we felt we couldn't say out loud to somebody. And then at the end of the process, we would burn the letter. It would allow us to finally let go of that situation, allow us to forgive ourselves or forget the situation. Programs like this, they worked on a peer support model. This organization was led all by veterans of some sort, whatever branch they were in, whatever type of MOS they had. It didn't matter if it was combat related or if you sat behind a desk the whole time. You were a veteran and you struggled with moral injury. It allowed you to lead from the front in a sense. Focus on things like deep listening, which is a core I can't talk. Deep listening, which was a core component of the entire week. It allowed me to learn how to sit and listen, not just with active listening, saying, okay, well, that's great. How did this go? How did you deal with that? But it allowed me to be present in my body as well, to show when I'm listening, I'm not just listening with my ears, but more with my person, my body, my eyes, my actions, to show that I'm fully invested in the conversation that we're having, where I hear you with all of me pretty much. With that, maybe we go to the next slide, please. Was sharing a little bit about that program that I was in, a big focus of learning how to help our loved ones, our veterans, is knowing what's available. Here is a couple programs that are available throughout the country that focus on healing versus just treatment. You have the Center for Post-Traumatic Growth, which is run by Mindy Keenan, the Project Welcome Home Troops, which is featured in the documentary Almost Sunrise, Warrior Camp, run by David Wood, the Shea Moral Injury Center, the Veterans of the Camino, which is a very interesting program I would love to be a part of someday, where you get to walk for 45 days in Spain. You get to be by yourself and process yourself for 45 days. Heroes and Horses, 6 weeks of working on a horse ranch, and a Boulder Crest retreat. These programs took a step beyond just treatment and focus on long-term healing, because anybody can put a Band-Aid on an injury and call it cured. But these programs are also looking at the long-term solution, how we make this person whole for the rest of their lives rather than just right now. But the one disclaimer I do have on these programs is that they are just what we recommend. It doesn't mean that they will work for the person you know. I would always suggest that you vet and review any program that is recommended to you, so the way you are not just taking my word or Tina's word for it, that you believe in what you're looking through. I believe next slide, Tina. Next, I want to scoot into communication. The part about working with your veteran, your loved one, or if you're the veteran working with your spouse, communication is key. I think this is something that Tina and I have a crash course in, and took us a lot of years to figure out how to properly work on. And as any expert, you fail and screw up and got to figure out how to get back on the horse with it. But let them take the lead. You don't want to force them. Sorry, my computer is messing up a little bit. You don't want to force them to talk about their traumatic experiences. You may have some people sometimes say that, well, in order to be effective in therapy, you have to call them out, or you have to bring this topic up now to get it over with. Well, sometimes pulling the Band-Aid off is the appropriate measure. But what I suggest to you guys is, don't force them. Let them be ready at their own time. With any trauma victim, you don't want to force. Encourage them. Don't pressure them. Participate in normal activities with their friends and families. Sometimes I just want to be stuck in the house and do yard work. I don't want to see neighbors, friends, family, or anything. At times Tina will say, well, why don't you go to grandma's house and mow her yard for her, or help her with this or that. It allows me to be encouraged to be around somebody else. Find a way to manage your own stress and be patient. You can't take care of somebody else on an airplane when it's going down if you don't put your air mask on first. So how do you expect to help somebody else if you can't take care of yourself? So as any veteran know, or as any spouse will know, a veteran is a stubborn, will put their heels in the sand. So be patient. Sometimes it's just a waiting game. One thing Tina can attest to is, learn about post-traumatic stress, learn about moral injury. The more you know, the better off you can be when the time is ready, the time is right for them. Support the recovery and healing, encourage professional help. We're not always the expert on everything, and sometimes having an outside person that is an expert will help that relationship more. Sometimes it's just the better road to take. And like I had said on the previous slide, offer deep listening when they're ready to share. Putting cell phones away, having kids out of the way, TVs off, just being present in the moment and putting your body language and your heart on them in a sense, rather than just your eyes. Show you're listening with your whole self. But yes, communication can be a very, very difficult thing. And really all you can do is just support your loved one the best you can. Next slide, please.
I just want to add a quick note on that. One thing that we've experienced with the veterans who share their stories for the certificate program, that when we sat down to record their stories, we have hours upon hours of a video testimonial from these veterans. They share that this was the first time they had ever shared that level of detail about their experience, especially their combat experience. I mean, many of them were 10, 15 years post-combat. So never shared it with loved ones, never shared it with a therapist. They only shared it with me and Kevin because of our relationship with them, and because they trusted our use of their story for the purpose of the certificate, and that they want helpers to be better prepared because they've experienced helpers who were not prepared, and felt tremendous hurt at the hands of those helpers. And again, I can't stress enough the importance of the deep listening, not just as the friend or the loved one or the spouse, but if you are a mental health professional, Doesn't matter, like Kevin said, many of his therapists had years and years and years of education. They were the expert, and they played that part. They weren't there to hear Kevin's story. They already had the answer when Kevin walked in the door. So learning from the veteran, that every experience is different, and they have something to teach you, I think is incredibly valuable as a mental health professional to embrace. So I just looked at my watch. We have a few minutes left.
Hurry up, Tina.
All right, so this ties into that we all play a role in healing of our veterans. So Edward Tick, he has a couple books that we also recommend. And he has a call to action for civilians, for the helpers, and for the loved ones, for society at large, that we must accept responsibility for our society's war making. To the returning veterans, our leaders and people must say, you did this in our name. And because you were subject to our orders, we lift the burden of your actions from you and take it onto our shoulders. We are responsible for you and what you did and the consequences. And this really speaks to the divide that so many veterans and service members feel, with the placating, thank you for your service, with no real desire to understand the sacrifices that our service members and veterans have made for our safety. So again, a call to action to be that person who's able to offer that deep listening for the veterans in your lives who are at a place who are willing to share their experiences and offload some of that weight they've been carrying. These are some of the books that we use in the certificate program, as well as the other ones on the previous slides, all of which we would highly recommend. So you'll have access to this. And then I also wanted to provide just a little bit of information about the certificate program. This is open to folks who are not MSU students. Every year we have roughly a third of students in the certificate who are not MSU affiliated. So we've had folks all over the country who work at the VA, work at the VBA, work for the DoD. We had a nurse in Hawaii. We also have VSOs, VSO directors, a huge long list of people who have found us because they want to learn more. They want to be able to do their jobs better, and they have not had the opportunity to learn through a certificate program like this. So we have the non-credit option for human service professionals, many of whom also happen to be veterans, and they've found the experience to be incredibly cathartic and healing, and opening them up to processing some of their experiences. It's sort of one of those surprising side effects of the class. And we've also had a lot of loved ones come through who, as a result of the class, have grown a lot closer to the veterans in their lives. All classes are fully online, and we have one cohort every year. Every cohort starts in May. So here's the website for that. Here's some references and some links, and then a little drawing from our daughter from many years ago, just to say thank you for attending today. And I know we had hoped to save some time for questions and discussion, but I see it's 12:30. I know I can hang out for a while longer if folks do have questions. But thank you all for attending today.
This was so excellent, and it was so helpful to learn more about moral injury, Tina and Kevin, and thank you for sharing, Kevin, your experiences. It's so helpful. We do have Juan put in the chat. One thing I learned from my own experience was that family would ask me, what was it like? Felt like I had to unload everything. Was not ready to do that. Sorry. My chat just went to more people talking. Sorry, moved on me. To unload everything, was not ready to do that at that time. After years of reflection, I tell people to instead ask, what do you want to share?
Yes, that comes down to letting the veteran, letting the service member take the lead. We can't expect that every veteran, or any veteran for that matter, is going to be in a place where they feel safe and heard and cared for to share some of their deeply traumatic experiences. And for some veterans, some service members, they never will feel that. And it's really unfortunate, and it's why we have the certificate programs. We have more people in the world who can provide those spaces. But it's something that we've heard many veterans share, that they never feel ready, even though their family members are desperate to learn.
Yeah, exactly. I just want to let everyone know if anyone's interested in the PowerPoint, or we have a short survey we can email to you. If you're on the phone, if you email mwrbattlecreek@dla.mil, we can send that and get that to you. And we will have a recording downloaded on our MWR Battle Creek page in a couple days as well. Again, thank you both for the excellence bringing this to light for a lot of people that aren't even aware of it. I see there's some on here commenting, great job. Thank you so much for organizing this, very eye-opening. Thank you so much. I highly recommend the certificate program. The certificate program is life-changing. I highly recommend it. Do you utilize any assessment tools as a question?
There are a few moral injury event. There's the moral injury event scale, which looks at what we know to be morally injurious events and if those have occurred. But in terms of scales that have been validated, there's very few available. The moral injury event scale is the one that I know of. There is more and more research in recent years being done on moral injury. And I almost included a slide, but again, I thought it was too far into the weeds, of even looking at different regions of the brain that are impacted by post-traumatic stress versus moral injury. So showing that there's neurological mechanisms at play that add weight to the argument that these are very unique types of injuries that need to be treated very differently, need to be dealt with very differently. So again, this is a growing field of research. But I feel like the people who need to hear it the most are still the furthest behind.
And another veteran was stating, I'm surprised after dealing with the VA since 2008 and suffering with PTSD, not once was moral injury mentioned to me. And that's what they stated. And I was just thinking about the prolonged exposure therapy and how many people I've talked to that it harmed them and didn't help them. And like you kind of explained in this, that we're talking, they're using a treatment for PTS when it's really a moral injury.
Yeah, and moral injury is still it's not a new thing, but it seems like a new thing. I had a colleague once years ago, is moral injury, is that, what did she say to me?
So the same as being a conscientious objector.
Yeah, I was like, well, no, not at all.
And this was a 30-year VA employee.
That said what? Can you say that again? What did she say?
I had mentioned a speaking engagement about moral injury years ago, and she asked, "Well, is that something like being a conscientious objector?" You know, and a lot of people are experienced and educated and so forth, but you don't know what you don't know. You know,
right?
If you're not experienced or exposed to certain aspects of this life of social work, you just don't know. So having more education and understanding of things helps lighten the load of what we're talking about.
I wanted to ask, and there's a pretty new therapy out there, ART, or accelerated resolution therapy. I've taken the basic, and there's an advanced and enhanced, and I know they're using it at like Walter Reed and Belvoir and some of the bigger places now are using this type of treatment. Do you know anything about that as far as how it relates to moral injury? Because I know they're using it for PTS.
Yeah, a lot of the sort of manualized therapies, they haven't been researched in terms of how they can help address moral injury. Like you said, they usually are connected to post-traumatic stress symptomology. The one I know of is impact of killing in war. That's a manualized type of therapy that's been used specifically for moral injury. If folks want to look into that one. Mindy Keenan's program, it's not an evidence-based treatment yet, but I know that she's been involved in a lot of research to document the effectiveness of her particular program. That again is focused exclusively on moral injury, not post-traumatic stress. But the complication with using a manualized therapy with something like moral injury is moral injury, what can be morally injurious to one person might not be to the next. So it's so unique from one person to the next that trying to capture it all and have the same effect from one person to the next is really, really difficult. Like the equine therapy has been used for some veterans with moral injury, and it's had great success. For others with moral injury, not so much, where instead the meditation was incredibly healing. So there's a lot of nuance and a lot of complication in terms of trying to pin down the interventions that we know can help with moral injury, because it can be different from one person to the next.
Yeah, I mean, not to interrupt you, I'm sorry, but the biggest advice I give on you about tips and tricks on that stuff like that is just be ready to fail. You know, as a practitioner, as a therapist, you're gonna mess up and screw up in the process of working with your clients, but don't give up. You know, acknowledge to your client that, you know, a mistake was made and just move forward. They'll see that your heart is in the right place and they'll be willing to still work with you, because not one thing in moral injury is going to fit every single person.
Exactly. And I'm glad we were having this discussion just for, you know, tools for moral injury and things that, you know, we can all do to try to be better at identifying moral injury and getting people the help they need, the veterans the help they need. I like what Chris just said. I love that you just brought up about future tools to see brain function, EEG, brainwave activity, MRIs, etc.
Yeah.
So yeah, again, I was talking about ART and the EMDR, so there's just not enough really to know if that is an impact at all on with the eye movements to know that if it's has an effect or not.
For post-traumatic stress, I know EMDR is even added to the evidence-based treatment modalities the VA uses, along with CPT and PE, but those are specific to post-traumatic stress.
Okay.
And too often, I know we've had students do their internships at the VA, and they've tried to bring up discussion around moral injury, that they've been assigned a veteran, and the stories that they've shared, the trauma they've experienced is very much in line with moral injury. And unfortunately, supervisors saying, okay, well, we're going to put them in this 8-week PTSD group, see how it goes, right? And it's been very frustrating for students because they're trying to bring what they're learning into the field. But it's a very, very big bureaucracy that's slow to change. So we're hoping to have social workers who've learned this information become part of these organizations, part of these bureaucracies, and bring about some change from the ground up. I know that these students have been able to have really profound discussions with the veterans that they've helped.
And thank you. I think the individual strategies that you talked about too, I hope, you know, I have people's email who signed up with their name. And so to share that information for things that you can do for recovering and healing. And Kevin, the program that you went to, I mean, that sounds like and that you had several of them listed that people can sign up for. And is that something like that you can get a grant for? How does that work?
Most of those programs are free of charge for veterans. I saw Kevin have a quizzical look, so I jumped in. I apologize.
Oh yeah, even with the one that I went to, the only requirement was that I had to pay for my way to get out there. Other than that, nearly $3,000 it cost for the week I was there, they pay for it all.
And so it was just a waiting list. Was that you said you had to wait like a year after you applied? So it's just a long wait because there's so many people wanting it.
Unfortunately, yeah. Some
Okay.
programs are quicker turnaround, others are shorter. I guess it all depends on how they function and such, but I couldn't tell you why it took so long.
Well, the demand is too high and supply is too low. There's just not enough of these programs available.
Better answer.
And far too many veterans who need these programs.
And I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I'm going to ask anyway. So say that, you have a veteran, a loved one, or you're working with someone that, you feel like it is moral injury, what would you say are the first steps that, or the recommendations that you would have for them to, or for us to try to help get them in the right direction?
Oh, that's a hard answer. I don't know, a hard question.
So what did you do with, I know that this was something, and working at the vet center, Kevin had a lot more flexibility.
I can do whatever I wanted, yeah.
He could do pretty much whatever he wanted as a therapist there. And they had moral injury support groups and things that the VA largely doesn't have. But I know you shared some stories of how you've helped veterans see that it was moral injury more so than post-traumatic stress. So how did you have those discussions with them?
It just came natural, authentic, I guess. So we'd be on a walk in the woods, or we'd be sitting on the back of a tailgate in a pickup truck in the parking lot, and we'll be talking about their stories. And I'm like, you know what? It does sound like you have a little bit of post-traumatic stress, but you ever heard of this? And just in a sense, like, just shooting the breeze with the guy and say, or the gal, and just say, hey, this is what I heard about. What do you think? Rather than being above them as a clinician and saying, you know what, you have a diagnosis in the big blue book that says you have this, this, and this wrong with you. I would always come to them and say, what do you think about this? Have you heard about this? And they'll start thinking about it and like, oh, they'll ask more and more questions. Like, I don't really know. Let's hop on the computer and figure it out together or whatever. And in that process, they would own their own diagnosis, or they would own their own notion of like, oh, well, maybe it is moral injury, or no, it's not moral injury, it's PTS. It allowed them to have more empowerment.
And I like Rhiannon said, maybe as veterans, we can help from the ground up as well, and mention it at our appointments and ask for more information and start inundating them with that at the VA to, we get the word out to veterans and these peer support groups that, are on, and everyone asking for that. So one question I had, Kevin, is so the vet center, that they will help anyone, and anyone can go to the vet center for like moral injury support groups?
Yes and no. So I'm not sure what anybody's experience level is with vet center. It was an organization founded just after the Vietnam War with Vietnam veterans who didn't trust the VA. Now, technically, I think in the 90s it started, where they became affiliated with the Department of Veterans Affairs. So they're shoulder and shoulder, I guess, with the VA, but they're not part of the VA. And anybody that's a veteran can go to the vet center, but also their spouse, their girlfriend, boyfriend, their kids. I had a handful of times where I was doing couples counseling, or I was talking to the significant other, or I think I had a few phone calls where I was dealing with little kids and such that were struggling with their parents. As long as there's a way I can tie it back to whomever the veteran is, I'm allowed to make my therapy however I think it's going to best fit them, rather than have a black and white plan. I even joked one time, I think in a discussion with somebody, it's like, hey, we want to bring your dog in because they have issues with you as a veteran. I'll talk to your dog for a while if you want. It just allowed me to have the freedom to be where they're at when they're ready to talk.
And that's a good point. That's an awesome point. That's really important for us all to do, for anyone dealing with moral injury, or is to meet them where they're at, for sure. Someone just commented in the chat, this is the first time I've ever heard of moral injury. I really appreciate the information, connected a lot of dots. Is there any push to add this to the DSM?
That's a Tina question.
I've heard both pros and cons, a lot of pros and cons to adding moral injury to the DSM. I think there'd be a lot of pushback from some pretty powerful entities And that having an official diagnosis for moral injury would mean that some pretty powerful institutions in our country would have to admit that they are injuring the souls of our young men and women. Right? It doesn't look good that we're morally injuring our men and women who've volunteered to serve the country. There's also pushback in that if it becomes an official diagnosis, what does that mean for disability rating and having to increase ratings for those who meet the criteria? Again, I think that any kind of wound, whether physical or moral or emotional, our veterans deserve to be recognized. And if it's affecting their functioning in life, they should be paid, right? They should be taken care of in that way. But that's some of the pushback I've heard as well, that adding it as an official diagnosis would be a huge overhaul of the rating system and billions of dollars having to be paid to veterans who meet the criteria. I'm kind of on the fence. I don't think the PTSD diagnosis has done a ton of good beyond disability ratings. And many veterans even push back on having that diagnosis, right? And I'm sure you noticed even in our talk, we call it post-traumatic stress. We leave off the disorder because the symptoms associated with post-traumatic stress are perfectly normal when folks have to live through incredibly difficult situations such as war. It's not a disorder, it's a natural outcome of having men and women experience those types of things. So I don't know. I'm on the fence as to whether I think it's a good idea. But I think that it would be a very, very, very steep hill to climb to have it added to the DSM for those reasons.
Makes sense. Well, I know we've kept you way over. Thank you for answering all the questions, but an excellent presentation. And thank you so much for the time today, both of you.
Of course, thank you all for staying on. It's good
Thank
to
you
see
very much.
familiar names.
Have a great day.
You too. Take care.
Bye-bye.